Rings of Power. It's been a journey through season 1 that at times has felt more like a battle, to stick with it that is. But it's one I've really wanted to stick with because I've been fascinated about what they're doing with it. Unfortunately, this fascination isn't because I've been enjoying the show for the most part, more about how perplexed I've been with the writing and some of the creative choices. So now we've got our season 1, one of possible 5 seasons. What are my thoughts? Well, I can honestly summarise it with one word, and that word is disappointing. However, now I've watched the final episode, I'm asking myself, is there actually some hope for season 2? Before I get into my thoughts, let me just reiterate that from the very beginning I wanted to like this show. I didn't go into it determined to hate it because they weren't following the Tolkien lore to the letter. Yes, I would have preferred this, and I think shows should follow the canon where possible. But with Lord of the Rings, I'm normie enough that I could have pushed all of that aside for an epic high fantasy show. That being said, let's look at some of the issues I had which I talked about in previous videos to see if any of these were resolved as the season progressed. I'm going to talk about episode 8, the final in the season, separately a little bit later. First up, the Galadriel problem. I didn't end up warming to this character any more as the episodes went on. In fact, some of the fight scenes where she was involved and had some of the training scenes with the Númenóreans were so bad that the character comes off so smug, I ended up disliking her even more. Just on this, in a previous video I said the directing was good. I would like to officially retract this statement. I was wrong. When I said this, I had in mind a number of scenes, like the Arondir Orc escape/fight scene, which until that point was a highlight. But the fight scenes that followed, especially those involving Galadriel, were at points laughable, and people more knowledgeable than me in directing, which is everybody, have pointed out errors. But to me, this type of theatrical combat detracts from the realism and pulls me out of the story. I know some people might be like, but it's fantasy, how much realism do you expect? What I'm talking about is an accepted set of laws and rules that operate within the universe, such as whether it's physically possible to make an orc explode by merely touching them with your blade as you flop along the back of a horse that's nowhere near them. I expect that shows at least make something feasible for me to believe, and that once these laws have been established, the show doesn't break them. For example, the orcs running around in daylight when in another scene they shy away from it. Or an elf getting injured and there being almost no blood, yet in another scene there's almost too much blood. Or a volcano erupting, yet all of the main characters happen to make it out okay and relatively uninjured. Or everyone blindly and unquestionably accepting Halbrand as the king of the Southlands because he happens to be carrying a crest. What if he found it? What if he stole it? I could go on, and I haven't even mentioned the scene where it appears as though Arondir and the Southlanders apparently meticulously chip away all the mortar between the stones of a tower so they could make it fall on the orcs. The time it would take to do this. That's what I mean by unrealistic. But back to Galadriel. In my view, this character is one of the biggest obstacles to me liking the show, and what's so frustrating about that is that I like Galadriel, just not this version of her so far. I think the show needs to drastically rethink where they're taking her for season 2 and start thinking of a few plausible reasons why she's been acting like a petulant teenager and course correct right from episode 1. Maybe they could pull a Dallas and make all of season 1 a dream or something. But while Galadriel stands out as a big problem, I didn't find much solace in the rest of the cast, which in my view amounted to an ensemble of vague and forgettable characters who at best were dull a lot of the time, and at worst either insufferable, superfluous or unlikable. But mostly they were dull. The dull thing was another huge barrier to my enjoyment. From episode 2 to 7 I honestly struggled to get through each episode. In the end I was splitting them into half-hour sections, and even then I was struggling to not scroll through my phone because there was nothing happening to hold my attention. Which leads me onto another issue. I felt nothing when it came to the big plot points. In the first half of the season we had an issue with too much setup and lack of payoffs, which I talked about in a previous video, while the second half of the season was clearly supposed to be full of payoffs. Problem is, I didn't care about them. I felt nothing. Am I a sociopath, or is anyone else feeling the same? The second half of the season is where we were supposed to get all of those juicy payoffs for all the bloated setups in the first half of the season. We had the Southlander/Orc battle, the creation of Mount Doom and Mordor, the discovery of Mithril, the Half-Orcs got some apples and some stuff about being left behind. We witnessed the actual creation of Mount Doom, but I felt nothing. I tried to think about this one in particular, to try and distill why it was I just didn't care, and I realised that, while on paper you could look at these major plot points and they might work, they're positioned at the right place in the story arc, and the premise should make for fantastic viewing. But the issue is that nothing in the show has layers, texture or depth, so everything feels flat with zero stakes having been established. Not the story or the characters or the dialogue. It's all flat. Add this to the fact that I didn't for one moment think that any of the characters were genuinely at risk, and what you have is a show that is very much paint by numbers and has no heart. There was a moment when Arondir and the Orc were battling, and the Orc had a blade right to his eye, and a lot of time was being spent showing this battle of strength as the blade inches closer, and as I watched this I thought to myself, this is clearly supposed to be a very intense moment. The problem was I knew that there was no way that blade was going to touch his eye, and of course it didn't. There is something missing. Stakes, heart, realism, good writing. Call it what you want, but it adds up to a very damning conclusion. For all the potential this show had, for all the ways they could have explored Tolkien's world within the canon, what we ended up with has been largely disappointing, because I don't think the writers are up to the task of filling in the necessary gaps to create a compelling story that grips you episode after episode. They only have the rights to the Lord of the Rings appendices, but are trying to tell a second age story, and they're clearly struggling to know how to fill the airtime. As a result, we're left with a major portion of the season that has, in my view, been simply filler. Now, with all that said, let's talk about the final episode. I won't go into spoilers just in case you haven't seen it yet. While it had its issues, such as Galadriel once again being a Mary Sue and figuring everything out on her own, this was by far my most enjoyable episode. Why? Because we finally got to the story, the Rings of Power. The episode progressed at a pace that didn't have me reaching for my phone, and I think I only rolled my eyes at the dialogue once. True to Tolkien canon or not, I largely enjoyed how the episode played out, the revelations that were revealed, to which I'm sure no one was surprised, and the tension that was built to lead onto season 2. So now I'm thinking there might be some minute flicker of hope for this show, not as something that is true to Tolkien's lore or canon, or even respectful to it to be honest, but simply as a show that could be entertaining in its own right as a piece of high fantasy. If you're someone who can't get over the breaks to canon, then obviously this won't ever be the case, and nothing the show does will make it redeemable. If this is you, I understand completely. I do say this with a degree of apprehension because in my view a lot needs to change to bring this up to a standard that I want and expect from something based on the Lord of the Rings. The nothing filler story, the bland characters, the bloated dialogue all has to go. My one hope is that Amazon Studios makes major changes for season 2. Whether this means hiring new writers, showrunners, I'm not sure. But if I was Amazon, I'd seriously be considering a great cull, given the amount of money thrown at this show. So that's where I'm at with Rings of Power. Am I giving up the ghost? I fully expected to be doing this video saying, that's it guys, I'm out. Gave it a good go, but I'm done. But the last episode has convinced me to at least watch the first episode of season 2 to see if these changes are likely. But they would need to exhibit some radical changes and right away to get me invested in continuing. But like I said, these are just my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think of Rings of Power now that the first season has aired. Is there any hope for season 2? Thanks for watching guys, and until next time, happy reading.